So my guest tonight is Dr. Drew Harville. She's an emeritus professor at Cornell University and affiliate professor at the University of Washington. She received her PhD from the University of Washington. Her research on host pathogen interactions and the sustainability of marine ecosystem has taken her from the reefs of Mexico, Indonesia, and Hawaii to the Pacific Northwest. The current focus of her laboratory group is on sustainable marine biodiversity and the ecology of host pathogen interactions in a changing ocean. A sub-theme of this work includes evaluating the impacts of the warming climate on marine ecosystems. Her analysis and papers have led to now widespread acceptance that diseases are restructuring marine ecosystems from the very climate-sensitive coral reef ecosystems to rocky temperate shores. She's also the author of this wonderful book that she sent me. It's called Ocean Outbreak, Confronting the Rising Tide of Marine Disease. So I wanted to start out saying, first of all, thank you, Dr. Harville, and thank you, Joe Bonner, who's my co-chair, who's behind the scenes. Appreciate it. And Dr. Harville, before I spoke to you, I had absolutely no idea. I mean, I've written about climate change, I've written about deforestation. I had no idea that the oceans, there was involvement with oceans and I guess rivers in disease, or that there was or there were pandemics that are occurring in oceans, and that actually oceanographers foresaw these pandemics coming. So why don't you just tell me about what you do and how come we don't know about this?
Thanks, David. I wish you'd known about this, really. But it is the case that sometimes the oceans are out of sight and out of mind. And so I guess you're not the only one. And indeed, that's why I wrote that book, is to try to make people more aware, because the oceans are so important to us. And I wonder, maybe a way to start this off might be for me just to show a couple slides, kind of as background, a little bit of information, just because this is a huge problem, and it involves all of the ocean and all the critters in the ocean. And so I just like to show this just to remind people what we're dealing with. So if you look at this cartoon I have here, essentially all levels of ocean biota are affected by disease, from essential marine habitats to keystone predators. And when we have a pandemic, which typically we define as a disease that spills over from one continent to another and involves multiple continents or a more global scale, it has enormous repercussions under the ocean. And some of these organisms are more important than others. We care about all of them, but some of them kind of control the dynamics of our ecosystems. And so when they have a widespread mass mortality or disease, it's a big problem. It can disrupt entire food chains. We have an example with our sea star outbreak that's causing species endangerment, and we're in the verge of listing one of these species as an endangered species, just based on the impacts from disease. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's kind of a big problem because we have, it's a natural thing, right, for anything to get sick. So, but there are human actions that are fueling bigger epidemics or more widespread ones. And I'll talk about climate change, because that's a big one right now. So there are these human and environmental causes, even under the oceans, where maybe we don't think we're having that much of an impact. And frankly, we are so dependent on the ecosystem services, the cycling, the healthy functioning of our oceans. We need to up our game to be dealing not just with the problems we have with COVID and other epidemics on land, but we also need to be thinking more broadly. And as I'll argue, hopefully you'll ask me about it, there may be some unusual solutions. Think about the critters, some of these critters in the oceans. The invertebrates have been evolving for over 600 million years. These are things that have been living in the petri dish of the oceans for a long time. So I would like to argue there's also some novel solutions we could expect if we upped our game.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you just go back to the slide? The first slide.
Okay.
So can you define oceanic biota and also keystone predators?
Oceanic biota, everything that's biotic that lives in the ocean. It could be kelp, it could be seagrass, it could be dolphins, it could be abalone or sharks. Any plant or animal or microorganism would be ocean biota. Oh, keystone predators. I'm glad you asked about that. As I talk about in this book, one of my mentors from when I was a grad student, and you don't have to comment that maybe that was a few years ago, but still, one of my mentors defined the term keystone predator as one that has a disproportionate impact on the ecology of its environment. And one of the big things, this guy right here on my screen, that is the original keystone predator. And when you take that away from the shore, the entire shoreline looks different. Mussels take over, the diversity declines, and it's become a central concept in ecology, the importance of keystone species in governing what happens either on land or in the ocean. And so I talk about keystone predators because, as I'll tell you about, one of our outbreaks involved an ecologically important thing like that. Does that make sense? Did you?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So that was a pretty complicated thing. I was just showing you, like, oh my God, everything in the ocean is affected by disease from, all at some level, and at some times from the plants to all the animals. And that just wasn't going to make a very readable book that was going to be able to make the points that I wanted to make about this. And so I decided to simplify my approach to this as a book for the public by picking 4 of them and using those to kind of tell this bigger story. And so we've done a lot of work. We've done decades of work on outbreaks of infectious disease in coral. So this guy here, this sea fan, has an infectious fungus, actually. And the coral's fighting back. That purple zone is the coral fighting back. And we spent decades studying the immune system of the coral and how it was fighting back. And, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but that has biomedical implications because, of course, we've got our own fungal diseases and we don't have enough medicines for them. So there's a big potential for new medicines from the ocean. Anyway, so we were studying coral outbreaks, and really I kind of use that to tell the story of there being a global threat to marine biodiversity, because our coral reefs globally are just the most heavily impacted ecosystem on our planet from climate change. And one of the spin-offs of the warming that coral reefs have been exposed to is an increase in infectious disease. Because the corals get stressed, they're more susceptible, just like my students at Cornell. When they're more stressed at exam time, everybody gets sick. They're more likely to pick up infections. And then the warming also causes a lot of these microorganisms that are pathogenic to cycle more quickly. So there's a big chapter in this book about the coral outbreaks because it really encapsulates the climate threats. I talk about the starfish outbreak because of the ecological importance. And we basically had our keystone species that were ecologically important toppled in what we would call an ecological domino effect. And it was also one that really affected the public, at least on our shores, people were really upset when over 20 species were dying from an infectious disease. And it was sort of the clarion call, the wake up for a lot of people in understanding, wow, disease can affect something like a starfish. They hadn't really thought about that before, like you hadn't thought about it. The abalone one, I don't have a lot of time to probably talk about why I chose that. It's one of the stories as a pathologist and as a disease ecologist that is one of my favorite, because again, this was a climate change related disease outbreak in abalone. And there were upwards of 7 species of abalone, which is this funny looking snail guy that people eat on the California coast. And again, this was a climate change outbreak that was causing millions of them to die. And it took well over 10 years to figure out the causative agent. And I kind of like to talk about the detective work in this book and how that's how we solve these things. So, and then finally, I included the story of the salmon outbreaks due to viruses, because I know that people care about salmon and care about food from the ocean being imperiled by disease. And again, climate change is really causing big problems for salmon and their health. And so that was part of that story. I don't know about you guys. Can you hear that cat in the background meowing? I might have to get him out of here.
Okay.
You need to be quiet. And then the final chapter in this book is the solution, how ecosystem services can improve ocean health. So that's just a few introductory things. I guess I could say a little bit about myself. I run a research lab at Cornell and at the University of Washington's Friday Harbor Labs. And we study the ecology of marine host pathogen interactions. And, you know, we study them from the perspective of their ecological importance, but we also study them because they're sentinels of change in our ecological interactions. And so some of the examples, I'm going to see if I can get this noisy animal out. Okay, why don't you go somewhere else? Excuse me. So the kinds of hosts that my group has worked on, we've done decades of work with corals and their immune systems. Right now, our biggest study system are seagrasses. And both of these are foundational ecosystems. So a big disease that kills or causes mass mortality on either a coral reef or a seagrass meadow is a major concern in the balance of nature in these ecosystems. And then the starfish epidemic is one that we've been working on for about the last decade. And I'm an ecologist. And so we always look at these host pathogen interactions in the context of the environment, whether it's a protozoan, a virus, or a bacterium that we're working with. Because a lot of these outbreaks can be triggered by changes in our oceanic environment. And that the biggest change that we're dealing with in every one of these examples is climate warming, which is triggering big increases in these outbreaks. And so there's a lot of marine organisms that have diseases that are temperature sensitive. So obviously the 3 I study, but any one of these are well-researched cases of marine critters, from lobsters to oysters to corals, that have infectious diseases that are sort of below their thermal optimum. So when the water's warm, they get worse. And this is the kind of stuff we do. I mean, we talk about improved marine disease surveillance, because if these disease outbreaks are driven sometimes by temperature warming, that means you can also forecast them and be able to do a better job of studying and eventually figuring out solutions. So I'm going to stop showing slides, David, and because maybe you'd like to ask me questions, and I can always bring back any of these that seem good.
Okay.
I don't want to just run through a talk here.
Thank you.
I like the fact that we can talk. Yeah.
And for people who are listening, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will read them. So, in your book, you said that one of the reasons people aren't so concerned about oceans is that you can see the oceans, you can go to a restaurant and get salmon, and it doesn't seem to be, you don't see anything like imminent. It's not like baby formula that all of a sudden you can't find. It's not like that. So, I mean, you can go to an ocean and it's, it looks great. I was watching the eclipse last night and the East River in New York looked wonderful and clean. And you're thinking, so what's the problem? So, as you said, you can always get fish. You can go to a restaurant and they don't say we're out of it, sorry, because of the disease. So I guess people don't see it. It's not like you go to the drugstore and you said, where's your baby formula? We don't have any, we're short. So it's not like that yet, but it's happening, right?
Yeah, it's certainly happening. I mean, salmon are struggling mightily with climate change, especially not only just in the ocean, but also in the rivers. And it is completely a combination of direct temperature stress, but also activation of different kinds of diseases. And so California is struggling most with this. But it's unfortunately coming to our waters. I live here now in the San Juan Islands, north of Seattle, almost into Canada. And we have the richest salmon runs in the continental US through here. And our runs are just horribly diminished through a whole combination of factors. But climate change is one that's a juggernaut that's rolling really rapidly through our ecosystems, and it will be affecting. It already is affecting the price of salmon and the availability of having wild salmon. Most of the wild salmon that you buy now probably comes from Alaska, more northern waters. So, yeah.
And I also want to ask you about when you were researching coral outbreaks, you participated in HydroLab, which is a federally funded underwater laboratory. So can you tell us about that HydroLab?
Oh, gosh. Well, that's taking me back towards the beginning of my career. I had the unbelievably great fortune as a graduate student to be invited along as a research diver on an underwater mission to study coral reefs in St. Croix using NOAA's saturation diving habitat. At the time, it was HydroLab. I ended up doing 4 missions, and later we used Aquarius. But the thing is, we lived underwater for a whole week, so we never went back to the surface. So it's an underwater laboratory. It's called saturation diving when you live underwater without going to the surface. And some of your viewers probably know that when you're diving, you can only spend a certain amount of time underwater because the nitrogen gas in the air mix accumulates in your tissues. But under pressure, it's like a soda can. It keeps the bubbles down, but as you go back to the surface, the bubbles rise and they cause trauma in your tissues. But if you're saturation diving and you stay underwater for a week, you're fine. And so we were studying coral reefs and some of the interactions of animals that were fighting with corals and the structure of those coral reefs. So it was just, for me as a grad student and as an early professor at Cornell, it was just the opportunity of a lifetime to do something that was just phenomenal. It was like being an astronaut. In fact, they called us aquanauts. So And in fact, NASA was studying us as you know, how do teams work in remote places? And since they couldn't study people on the moon, they studied us under the water. Yeah.
I interviewed the team that was in Hawaii who was duplicating, trying to duplicate, the surface of Mars and staying together in one place. They also shortened time in them and things. So I can see that. And also, so a lot of your book talks about the death of starfish, and that it's going to cause a cascade of ecological impacts and more disease. So what was killing the starfish, which I know, but, and you basically discovered what was killing it, but there wasn't much you could do about it, right?
Yeah. Oops.
Okay.
Let me pull back my slides because I have just a couple things that might give it a little perspective and show how that all worked. Just ignore my messy screen here. So this ended up being the largest marine wildlife. We call it an epizootic. It's an epidemic if it's humans. Dem is for humans. Epizootic is for animals. So, and it ended up being a panzootic or pandemic because it affected more than one continent. It started in 2013 with these animals literally just falling apart like this. And the reason it's the largest one is because there were over 20 different species affected. So it's what we as disease ecologists or even a pathologist or an epidemiologist would call a multi-host pathogen. And of course, it won't be lost on you that COVID is also a multi-host pathogen, and that's partly what makes it a little difficult. So we're not the only hosts for COVID. There's also deer and mink and cats, which creates other opportunities for the evolution of these new variants. So this was a multi-host pathogen affecting our sea stars. Plus they're ecologically important. And we found out as we continued to study this that there was a climate link, that the intensity or the level of mortality was fueled by warming in the oceans. That was 2013. We continue to study this, and it's still going on now, 2022. So just about a decade. It's kind of mind-blowing to me that this is still continued. I wish I could give you the full answer about what the causative agent is. In a paper that we published pretty early on, we provided evidence for a viral sized fraction through a series of experiments, and we're continuing to pursue that avenue. It's a little harder to study the causative agent of a starfish than a causative agent of a human. And that's because we don't have cell lines for these. So we can't actually grow a virus in an echinoderm cell line because we don't have those. So it's a little bit, we don't have the same resources that, say, the CDC has for human diseases. I just want to give you a vision of what this looked like when it started, though. This is an underwater photograph taken by an underwater photographer, Neil McDaniel, who's been an incredible partner in this. And he took this on October 9th, 2013. And here it is 20 days later, October 29th. All of these giant, this is the biggest starfish in the world and the fastest, and has the most legs. All of these died, and all this white are just the piles of spicules and dead bodies from all of these stars. So that was the beginning of it in 2013. This is only one of those 20 species that have been affected by this disease. But this is the one that was the most susceptible, even in our early experiments. And so we were a little concerned with a multi-host pathogen that the most susceptible species could be at risk. And in fact, that's turned out to be the case. This has now been registered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature as an endangered species through some of the work that our recovery program has done. And NOAA in our country is talking about listing it as an endangered species. So that kind of is this recovery plan. Pycnopodia is what this big giant species is called. So it's 90% globally declined if you compare it before and after. And if you just look on the continental West Coast, so that would be the US West Coast from basically the border with Mexico to the border with Canada, it's 97 to 98% declined. And that is all from this one disease outbreak. So I guess I'd like, to sort of use that as an example of the kinds of damage that can be done by an infectious disease in a really rapid time. Now, this is one of our best studied ones because these species, a lot of them are intertidal and we could count them on the shoreline. And so this can also be happening, for example, with, a zooplankton, a very tiny thing, or a species of algae. They can just disappear without anybody really noticing it. And that kind of, David, gets back to your question, like, why don't we know about this? Because, it's hard to study this stuff happening under the ocean. Yeah, so that's, did I answer your questions about?
You did. So I have some questions from the audience. So you want to, should we read those?
Yeah.
Okay, so one is, okay, so you want to lose the, okay. Does water warming cause outbreaks by making pathogens more prominent and aggressive, or by inhibiting the host immune system, or both?
Both. Good question.
Okay.
And we have lots of examples of both of those things happening, either separately or together. So corals are a really good example because the warming is causing declines to, worldwide just from the warming, because corals are so close to their upper thermal limits. So there you have a host that's stressed. So it much more, and we've shown, there's a lot of studies now that have shown that the corals, when they're bleached and stressed, pick up disease infections more quickly than they don't recover from that. But we also know from some direct culturing work that some of those microorganisms, some of the bacteria that cause the disease, grow faster under warmer conditions. And so that's a case where you have the double whammy of both the host being stressed and the pathogen being more virulent or more fast growing. And so it's pretty much the same situation with our seagrasses that we're studying now. This is a case where we do know the causative agent. We know that it's a protozoan that causes these kinds of lesions in our seagrass, which is an eelgrass. And this is what that causative agent looks like. If you culture it, it has these little spindle-shaped cells growing in its culture, and then it eats up the eelgrass tissue. So again, we can grow this. This is one of the diseases that we can study well because we can grow it in culture. And so we actually know that it grows faster under warmer conditions. We know that it creates bigger, more damage under warmer conditions. And we've recently done a study. We're working on this at what we call continental scale. So we're studying this from San Diego with partners at all of these nodes to Alaska. And we find pretty high levels of disease. So here's our study site in Washington State, which is right there. And 75% of the plants of the thousands, that's 75% of thousands that we surveyed, have the disease. And through this study, using artificial intelligence to analyze our scans and drones to do surveys, we've been able to show linkages with temperature. And we're excited about a paper that's coming out very soon showing that with these positive temperature anomalies, the level of disease in places increases. So I'm not going to show any more. And I guess one more thing, because this didn't happen where you guys were. This happened where we were. We had the heat dome. So when we talk about climate warming having impacts, I just want to give an example of what that looks like. I mean, this is like cold water, right? We live in Washington State. That's almost as far north as you can get in the US. It's supposed to be cold here. And we had a heat event. It was called the Pacific Heat Dome last summer, that built up and built up and built up and built up and sat over this, area that's normally really cold. We had 103-degree temperatures on my deck. That was 20 degrees warmer than had almost ever been recorded. So this had enormous impacts on our marine ecosystems and on our terrestrial places. So those are the kinds of events that are triggering big changes.
Okay, so some more questions. So one question, is there any way to vaccinate marine life?
Yeah. Well, sort of marine life is a big thing. There's a lot of invertebrates, there's a lot of algae, and then there's mammals. And so mammals can be vaccinated because they have what we call adaptive immunity. And so there are veterinarians that have developed vaccination programs for some marine mammals. Some of the endangered marine mammals are cases where there's been some very simple vaccination programs developed. But you can imagine it's kind of a struggle, right? How do you get to every seal to be able to vaccinate it? And of course, it's not a possibility for all of our invertebrates that have innate immune systems that are not sort of antigen antibody based. And so we can't develop vaccines for those. So that's a great question because it points to the problem that we're having to manage an ecosystem where all of the things you do normally on land to control, even like wildlife disease, are not tools we can use. We can't typically quarantine. We can't typically vaccinate. And it's not even very easy to cull every sick individual if you wanted to do that. And so you can sort of see we're dealing with kind of a big problem in the ocean and trying to manage these increasing levels of infectious disease. So yeah, good question. Thanks for that.
Okay, so another question is, how would you compare marine outbreaks of disease to human outbreaks of disease? For example, COVID-19.
How was the question? How do I compare them?
How would you compare marine outbreaks of disease to human outbreaks of disease?
Well, they're very comparable to me. I mean, I have training as an epidemiologist, and so when the COVID outbreak began, I knew what was going to happen. I mean, I know the mathematical models and I understand how they work. And so when I saw some of it's called R naught, which is the sort of the epidemiological spread rate for COVID, I knew we were in big trouble. So for an epidemiological model, it doesn't really matter whether you're studying a seal, a starfish, or human. What's important is to understand the rate at which the disease transmits and how infectious it is and what kind of damage it causes to the host. I don't want to sound I don't want to oversimplify it or sound like I think that starfish and humans are the same, because I mean everybody has suffered enormously from this COVID outbreak, and it's to me, it's just a huge frustration that we haven't been able to manage it better so that there were fewer impacts to humans. So I hope I answered that question.
You did.
For example, we have, COVID is what we call a multi-host pathogen, right? It affects multiple species. It's a zoonosis, right? That's how we think. You had a wonderful speaker that you interviewed last week, Dr. Vora, who was talking about spillover events. And we know that COVID likely originated as a spillover from something like a bat, because it can live in more than one species. So many of our marine diseases are also multi-host pathogens. They can live in more than one species. And our starfish, for example, is one. So I've already said it affects over 20 species. Some of the avian malaria of birds are multi-host pathogens. Lyme disease, yeah.
Okay, so next question. Are there other marine animal species that are expanding to occupy the niches vacated by the infected species you mentioned?
Sometimes, yes. But for example, if you think about coral reefs, when you lose a coral reef, some other things come in, maybe some marine plants, maybe some sponges or some other invertebrates, but not the kind of habitat forming, nursery creating, biodiversity preserving conditions that something like a coral reef has. So that's not being replaced by something better. Similarly with the sea star outbreak, and I'm sorry if I sometimes go back and forth between calling them sea stars and starfish. It's because they're not fish, right? So we're not so happy calling them starfish, even though that's what everybody's gotten used to. So I try to stick with sea stars. So we've lost this top predator, and what's happened is the things it used to eat have exploded, and those things are sea urchins. Now, sea urchins are great, and they're important herbivores in the ocean, but they're not great when they explode. And so what's happened is, with the removal of these keystone sea stars to zero in many habitats, the urchins rapidly overpopulated, and they ate and completely denuded kelp beds. And so there are huge stretches of the California coast where kelp beds have been denuded by sea urchins. And that is not replaced by anything good. And in fact, it's having a big impact on fisheries. It's having a big impact, for example, baby fish use kelp beds as habitat. Crabs use, it's a really important habitat. And so there's a lot of work underway to try to figure out how to get those beds back. And so they're not being replaced by something of comparable value in terms of a home for supporting biodiversity or fisheries.
The next question is, have resistant individuals been identified among the susceptible species?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big push in some of the work that we're doing with the sea stars. In addition to exposing them to the causative agent and working back to what that virus might be, we also study the transcriptomics, or the genes that are activated by exposure to these viral fractions in the pursuit of understanding the immune systems, and thus maybe being able to breed more resistant stars. Also part of our program, which has been largely funded by the Nature Conservancy, actually, is the breeding of captive stars. So again, that endangered species, there's a whole captive breeding program at Friday Harbor Laboratories with little baby stars being produced, with the hope that, again, as we learn more about resistance, we may be able to breed a little bit more resistance into them. At the same time, there's scientists studying the survivors from this big mass mortality to understand what kinds of genes might be contributing to their survival. So it's a very active area of research that I think is quite important.
Okay.
Again,
and-
these are invertebrates, so they don't have adaptive immunity, but they do have what we call innate immune systems that remember, they've been living for maybe not upwards of 500 million years in the ocean and dealing with a lot of these pathogens on a routine basis. So we think there's going to be some really important tricks to the way they respond to pathogens.
Okay, and someone who's not giving their names as anonymous, when can we expect your new paper to come out? And can you describe what findings we can expect to read about?
Our most active area, our best funded area of research is with the eelgrass and the eelgrass disease. And so the paper that we've just had accepted really nails down some of the climate links in this really important disease that's decimating some of our seagrass beds on the West Coast. We're actively working on more of the sea star work. I think the captive breeding program work, which I'm not an author on that. It's another colleague, Jason Hodin, is doing that work. That work should be coming out. I hope we'll have some updates on the mechanisms of resistance and the causative agents maybe in another year on the sea star work. Other work that we're interested in, thank you for that question. Other projects that I hope will be out soon are what I would call ecosystem services or pathogen fighting services in nature. And if I can just talk a little bit about that, I might just show one other slide. Let's see. Oh, I need to share my screen again. Sorry. It's hard to keep track of all this stuff. A lot of buttons to push to get back to here. This is kind of, this is kind of the real reason for writing this book, is what are the solutions? I don't have all the answers, but there's some things that I think that are really important. So I've been talking about the fact that we have epidemics, infectious epidemics in the ocean that are causing mass mortality. And I've given the examples of sea stars, corals, seagrass. Of course, COVID is another one, and there may be climate change links in that. I don't actually know about that, but in both the oceans and on land, climate change is accelerating disease. I'm more focused, as my expertise is in the ocean. And so I'm concerned about the fact that we have this positive feedback between epidemics that are occurring and the fact that climate change is making them worse. And in terms of the realm of solutions, one of the things I've been thinking about, and we've done some research on recently, is just focusing on nature's powers for pathogen reduction. And again, I think in the oceans, there's some amazing possibilities, and I'll just throw out a few of them. This is the last chapter of my book, is talking about this. Of course, probably, David, you have a group of people that know a lot about disease and microbiomes. And so we have bacteria living in our bodies that kill bacteria. We know that quite a few marine organisms have also microbiomes. For example, corals have bacteria living on their surface that can kill other bacteria and make them healthier. We stand a lot to learn from studying how these natural biomes in the ocean work and control disease. There's a very rich series of examples of drugs that have been harvested from ocean organisms. A few decades ago, one of the highest hit rates for the discovery of new leads for drugs came from sponges. I was able to work on some of those projects. So again, remember, these invertebrates have been fighting microbes and pathogenic microbes in the ocean for hundreds of millions of years. So there are some really exciting solutions that we would stand to benefit to learn more from. We find marine protected areas are a big management tool for ecologists and natural resource managers in the ocean. And we find that quite a few organisms show reduced disease in these healthy protected areas. We don't really know why. I think we should figure that out because it's useful information. We've been studying eelgrass, and this is the biggest example that I want to talk about. We started our work in Indonesia, and what we found is that in the eelgrass meadows, the levels of pathogenic bacteria were half of what they were just outside the meadows. And the reason we were studying that is because we had gotten sick in those waters, and so we wanted to know what was in the water, and we realized how much sewage was going in and how many pathogenic bacteria were actually in the water.
You got very sick. I mean,
we got pretty sick. Everybody got sick.
And one person had to be flown out.
Yeah, we had to send my Australian colleague got typhoid, and we had to send her home. We all got amoebic dysentery, and so it wasn't a very good joke, but some people thought it was sort of like a funny thing or ironic that the disease ecologists all got sick. But what it made me realize is there were links between human health and environmental health. And we now call that One Health. And so we decided to study that linkage. And we were really impressed when this was years and years of a really detailed complete bacterial sequencing study showing that 50% of the pathogenic bacteria were reduced in these seagrass meadows. So that led, and the levels of coral disease were lower in the seagrass meadows. So that's led us to be studying in the waters of Puget Sound whether our eelgrasses, our seagrasses also have a pathogen reducing capability. And this work isn't published yet, but back to that question, that nice question about what we are going to be publishing. I hope in the next year that study will come out again, showing that a natural vegetation system like seagrasses can significantly reduce pathogens in the water. So that's a solution, not just for starfish and abalone and maybe dolphins, but also for humans. And so we actually called that pathogen cleansing.
So we have two questions. One is, what triggers nature to reduce pathogen counts? Why would nature work towards balance? Isn't this anthropomorphic?
Oh, well, the way that's the way you've asked that question, it is.
I didn't ask.
No, I know you didn't, David. And I don't mean to insult the person that asked it. I just want to point out that nature has no intention of controlling diseases, but so maybe the way I've worded this is bad, but what I want to imply is that there are important mechanisms within nature that do control disease. It's not that nature is working on this as a project. And another one of these is bivalves, which oysters, mussels, and clams also filter out pathogens and then reduce the disease risk. And so all of those examples that I've gone through, and thank you for listening to that, I think we have a new science frontier in the ocean, and that's to really look at mechanisms of disease regulation in nature. And I might even call that nature's superpowers, if you don't mind my kind of going a little off the deep end on that. They're superpowers in the sense that they're really pretty poorly understood. Is we don't know, for example, what it is in seagrasses that reduces the number of bacteria. We know, well, we know a little bit. We know it's the oxygenation is part of it, but it's a lot more than that. I think this is something that a lot more research effort should be put into, that would be both beneficial for humans on land as well as organisms in the ocean. And, you know, I think Joe put a link to my New York Times op-ed from, well, it was near the beginning of the pandemic, so that's 2 years ago now, just talking about nature's solutions for reducing disease in the ocean. For example, there's salmon that have coronaviruses, okay? And the coronaviruses are respiratory viruses that are damaging for the gills in salmon. So studying those may provide us some new approaches to dealing with our own coronavirus.
Okay, Joe just put it in the chat, the New York Times op-ed, how starfish, snails, and salmon fight pandemics. So there's one or two more questions I want to get to. Well, first, the same person who asked that question about Nate, want to thank you for the great work you're doing and your lifetime of dedication to some of these horrendous problems. Fantastic. But here's the question.
Thank you.
Is it possible that another pandemic could be triggered by marine animals? Okay. I'll repeat it. Is it possible that another pandemic could be triggered by marine animal?
David, I missed that. We've had such good reception, but I just had a little trouble with the Wi-Fi. I didn't hear that question.
Okay. So is it possible that another pandemic could be triggered by marine animal or animals? You can read it in the Q&A box.
I'm sorry, I lost you for a minute.
Okay.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. Is it possible that another pandemic could be triggered by a marine animal or animals?
You know, I don't see, we don't really have examples of threats from the ocean to us. I think that's remote. I think it's much, the threat goes the other way. We on land are an enormous threat to the oceans because the oceans are downstream of land. Now, I know people realize that sometimes there are, bad bacteria in something like oysters. We definitely can get sick from pollution that compromises our oceanic food. But so far there hasn't been any example of anything that's infectious that spreads. Something like, we're a little concerned now with the bird flu issues with chickens, for example, in our country. A number of them are carrying the bird flu, and that can be transmitted to humans. There's just no examples like that from the ocean.
Okay,
so for now, I guess I'd like to say I think we're the bigger threat to the ocean than the ocean is to us.
So, you're okay. So here's the book Ocean Outbreak. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it in your independent bookstore. And a question that we ask, what can the average person do to help the oceans?
I think you have to follow your passions. I don't like to give a formula for what people need to do. They need to, I'd say get involved. Ask that question, what can I do to help the oceans?
Okay.
It might be that you would join the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is unbelievably great in terms of their ocean program. It may be that you want to get involved at your local aquarium. There will be good advice there. It may be there's some really exciting citizen science projects that you could get involved with if you're in a coastal area. there's so many things. I think the most important thing is that you get engaged, get involved, and be careful about how you vote, because that's probably the most important thing is to vote for leadership that's paying attention to the health of our oceans and the health of our natural environment.
So can you point to a country that's doing a good job? I mean, people used to point to, during the pandemic, people said, New Zealand did a really good job of handling it. And so is there a country, is there a simile to a country that's doing a great job in ocean preservation?
Oh gosh, that is such a good question. And I don't want to give the wrong answer because it's a really important question. The ones that come to mind, New Zealand actually is very good. I mean, New Zealand is an ocean country, right? I mean, they're an island. So
Right.
their oceanic resources are incredibly important, and they have excellent ocean conservation and management programs. Similarly, I've worked a lot with Australia. And in terms of the ocean research and the ocean management, especially of coral reefs, Australia has been fantastic and done well. They also rely heavily, they've been criticized for relying so much on fossil fuels, which are causing climate problems, which is not a good thing for the coral reefs. I think our country does a pretty good job. I'd actually like to say it's been really satisfying for me to work more local. I've done a lot of international work. It's been really satisfying to work on more domestic marine issues because we actually have really good laws and policies. They're not perfect, but they can, if we work on them harder, we could do a really good job and be a great example to some other places. Yeah.
Okay, so we've come to the end. Is there any closing statement you want to give?
Thank you so much for having me on, David. I've really enjoyed this, and I am impressed with the good questions and the level of interest of you folks there that are listening, and I have really enjoyed that. And I hope you like the book, and there might be others in another year or two, so keep an eye out.
We will, and I hope you'll come back. Okay,
Yeah.
anyway, great. And everyone there stays safe, and we'll see you soon. Okay, take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harville.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.